the US bond market is really absolutely crucial to the power of the United States. And anything that casts doubt on the stability of US public finances is going to cast doubt on the safe asset status of the US Treasury.
On WealthTrack, famed historian Niall Ferguson reflects on the investment implication of America's changing role as the world's military and economic superpower.
Funding provided by ClearBridge Investments, the Fairholme Foundation, First Eagle Investments, Bill Miller, Baird, Strategas Asset Management, Research Affiliates, Royce Investment Partners, Seafarer Capital Partners, and Women Investing in Security and Education.
Hello and welcome to this edition of WealthTrack. I'm Consuelo Mack. We are living in a history-making era. The world's superpower, that is the United States, is being redirected from the top by its president in two major areas: trade and military power. The old post-World War II rules of international free trade and U.S. military leadership and dominance are being discarded, and new rules of protectionism and divided military responsibility are being put in their place. These are seismic shifts, global shocks, as two recent guests describe them. You can see our interviews with global strategist Nick Sargent and international financial thought leader John Lipsky on WealthTrack.com. Are there any historical precedents for these developments? Well, who better to ask than acclaimed historian Niall Ferguson in part 2 of our recent interview with him. You can watch the first installment about the economic and market impact of Trump's tariff policies on WealthTrack.com. When not traveling and speaking, Ferguson is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard. He is also a prolific writer for numerous publications, including the Free Press, as well as the author of 16 books. In a Free Press article titled "Trump Tariffs and the End of American Empire," Ferguson referenced one of his books, Colossus, The Rise and Fall of the American Empire, published in 2004, in which he predicted the American empire would decline and fall in our time, and that it was more likely to come, as it came to Gibbon's Rome, from within. I asked Ferguson to describe the American empire as it has stood since 1945, at the end of World War II.
Well, Americans don't like using the word empire about themselves, and ever since I wrote the book Colossus, I've had to kind of preface all answers by saying you don't need to call it an empire. You can call it hegemony or primacy, whatever you like. The rest of the world essentially sees it as an American empire, and you can understand why, because since the end of World War II, 80 years ago, the United States has been the dominant economy in the world. And it has also been the dominant military power in the world, with troops and ships and submarines and planes distributed all over the surface of the earth, with also a formidable nuclear arsenal that makes war with the United States something that you undertake only with trepidation. So what's fascinating is to see the way the role of the United States evolved over time. At the end of World War II, the US was just about the only economy that was really not in a state of collapse.
Right.
And the US was a huge proportion of global GDP. And the US then set about rebuilding devastated Europe, devastated Asia, and supplying the capital for much of that reconstruction to be done. The Marshall Plan was just part of a huge reconstruction program that the United States undertook. The other thing that happened early on was that it became clear that the Soviet Union did not want to participate in an American-led global reconstruction and wanted instead to have its own sphere of influence, hermetically sealed and run on the basis of the Soviet version of Marxism-Leninism. And so the United States played the second role, which was to defend parts of the world that felt threatened by Soviet aggression, particularly Central and Western Europe, but also many parts of Asia, not to mention Latin America. So those roles have a characteristically imperial character. The United States was intervening, for example, in Korea in 1950. It was later going to intervene with disastrous results in Vietnam. And these interventions, which carried on beyond the Cold War, have been one of the characteristic features of American foreign policy. The intervention in Iraq and Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11 was just the most recent example. So the United States has played this classically imperial role, global in its extent, and Americans have constantly debated whether it's a good thing or not. And that brings us, I suppose, to our own time, when I think we've seen a real backlash against the imperial enterprise because of disillusionment with what happened in Afghanistan and especially in Iraq.
You're right. The concept of America as the world's superpower and the responsibilities that we have assumed because of that, that is under attack now. Talk to us, which you don't hear about. I mean, the positives of basically running an empire, the positives of being the world's superpower, both militarily and economically. What did we gain from that? I don't think people realize the benefits that accrue to having that position. They're only thinking about the costs.
Well, that's right. Since really the end of the presidency of George W. Bush, there's been a bipartisan revolt against, you can call it neoconservatism if you like, but against the kind of imperial version of American foreign policy. It was actually Barack Obama who said, we are not going to be the global policeman. He was in there before President Trump with his arguments against forever wars. And so we've had a kind of bipartisan retreat brought about, I think, by disillusionment with the global war on terror. And so there comes a point when you ask yourself, well, why were we ever doing that anyway? And the answer is fairly obvious. I mean, if you hadn't been prepared to deploy American troops and American resources during the Cold War, then the Soviet Union would have been able to acquire an even larger communist empire, and that would certainly not have benefited the United States. Winning Cold War I was a very important thing to do. If one thinks back to the shock this nation experienced after 9/11, and the sense that the United States had to do something to stop that kind of terrorist attack happening again, well, it hasn't happened again. You can debate why that was, but I think it's important to recognize that the Islamic extremists have found it very hard indeed to launch a comparable attack on the United States, even although they've continued to operate in other parts of the world. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, they continue to kill people in very large numbers. So one other reason for American power mattering is that it's very important to make sure that organizations like Al-Qaeda or Islamic State cannot kill large numbers of Americans with terrorist attacks. So there were, I think, arguments for having the kind of military capability, the power projection that the United States has had since World War II. And now, of course, we face in the People's Republic of China a new superpower, also communist, more technologically and economically advanced than the Soviet Union ever was, and posing meaningful threats to US interests and the interests of American allies. The Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 would not have happened and could not have been sustained without Chinese backing and Chinese economic support. So in a sense, the world has not really advanced all that far. We had a kind of lull between Cold War I and Cold War II, but we're now in Cold War II. The idea that we can just kind of reduce our defense expenditure, come home, and the world will leave us alone, I think is a somewhat implausible one.
One marker that you've written a great deal about is something called Ferguson's Law, not named after you, named after a fellow Scotsman, but from the 18th century. And the law is that once a country's interest payments on its debt exceed the payments that that country makes on defense as a percentage of GDP, that is a signal of a country or an empire's decline. Can you explain that?
Well, this is the key point, that debt has become a bigger and bigger part of our economic story, really since the 1980s. And we've seen a very major increase in the federal debt relative to the size of the economy in the last decade or so, as a series of shocks hit us, financial crisis, then COVID, and we now face a situation in which the debt has reached a level we haven't seen relative to GDP since the end of World War II. It's above 100% of GDP. And the crucial measure, as I tried to point out in my Ferguson's Law paper, is that if you're spending more on interest payments on your public debt than you are on defense, you're probably not going to be a great power for very much longer. That's the lesson of Habsburg Spain in the 17th century. It's the lesson of Ancien Regime France in the 18th century. It's the lesson of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century and the British Empire in the 20th century. So the United States has now accumulated such a large debt, and it continues to add to it because the deficit is north of 6 or 7% of GDP this year, potentially rising. That means that the resources available for modernizing our military capabilities are being squeezed. And that's a very big problem, as history shows, for a power that has as many commitments as the United States. You know, we have at least indirectly committed ourselves to the defense and independence of Ukraine. We didn't deploy troops, or at least only advisors, but we've actually deployed a lot of hardware to support Ukraine. We're very much involved in the Middle East, have been for many decades, making sure that Israel has the wherewithal to resist the threats posed to it. And then there's Taiwan, because out there, off China is an island that the Chinese say belongs to them, and we kind of agree, but we also say that we'd like it to remain autonomous and democratic and not be forcibly brought under the control of Beijing. And that is the issue that I think is probably going to be the most tricky issue for President Trump if, as I think they will, the Chinese decide to push the envelope on Taiwan at some point while Trump is still in the White House.
And why do you think that, Neil? Why do you think that this is a particularly fraught time?
Well, Xi Jinping constantly says that it is vitally important that Taiwan not become independent. I mean, functionally, it is independent. If you go there, you'll see a fully functioning democracy that is not controlled from Beijing. And so the one China policy is really a fiction in practice. This is a huge issue for Xi Jinping, who would love nothing more than to bring Taiwan under the control of Beijing the way he's been able to bring Hong Kong under the control of Beijing. And that has been achieved, and achieved without firing a shot. Why does this matter so much? Taiwan is where the most sophisticated semiconductors in the world nearly all get made. And those are the semiconductors without which you cannot do artificial intelligence. So there's a huge economic prize sitting there just off the Chinese coast, the prize of controlling the semiconductors on which AI runs. And I just don't think that Xi Jinping is prepared to leave the position that he now holds, in effect the lifetime presidency, without having settled this business. He wants Taiwan to be his capstone achievement. And the thing is that President Trump has already made it known, he said this to John Bolton, and John Bolton put in his memoir, that he doesn't think it's worth fighting a war with China over Taiwan. So the opportunity is there for I think for Xi Jinping to make a move and hope that Donald Trump sticks to that position and does a deal rather than fight World War III.
We not only have China, to be concerned about, but we also have other nuclear powers as well, whereas there were no other nuclear powers except for the Soviet Union back after World War II. So therefore, does our calculus need to change? Perhaps it is in our best interest to withdraw, because the consequences of confronting, as you just described, China over Taiwan would just be too devastating.
Henry Kissinger once said that the president should not be presented with a choice between blowing up the world and surrender. And the danger in almost all Cold War conflicts is that it seems to be that kind of a dilemma. Now we have not only one nuclear superpower, which Russia still is, not an economic superpower, but it's definitely a nuclear superpower in terms of the size of its arsenal. We have another because China has been building its nuclear arsenal up at an amazing speed. And one of the ways in which the balance of power has fundamentally changed in the last 20 years is that we've gone from a world in which the United States was clearly militarily the dominant power and also the dominant manufacturing power, with manufacturing value added roughly double that of China 20 years ago, to a world in which China has the manufacturing capability roughly double that of the United States. And China has also closed the military gap in ways that are truly formidable when you look at them. The Chinese have invested not only in nukes, they've invested in missiles, including hypersonic missiles. They've invested in their navy, which is now larger numerically than the US Navy. They're investing in every category of weapon. They probably are the dominant manufacturer of drones, the weapon of the future, if the war in Ukraine is anything to go by. And so the balance of power, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, has tilted against the United States, which means we don't really have deterrence the way we did in the 1990s. The US probably still has the edge in quality. In fact, I'm certain that it does.
In quality of
military capability
weapons.
in every in pretty much every category. The war games, I think, bear out that the United States has got superiority in quality, but it doesn't have superiority in quantity. And there are obvious risks. We're heavily reliant on military satellite communications, without which our forces are blind. It's clear from at least some war games that the Chinese would aim to target those communications systems, and that would pose a really existential problem for any American war effort.
We've just discussed the New World Order, the fact that for the first time since World War II, that the U.S.'s supremacy militarily and economically is being seriously challenged. Is there a way that we can become more competitive, or that we can keep our competitive edge?
So the United States can bounce back. I think to bounce back, a couple of things need to happen. It needs to stabilize its public finances, but it also needs to rebuild its defense industrial complex, because you certainly can't be a great power if you're not manufacturing the key strategic weapons without which your great power status is open to question. So those are the two big challenges, not only for this president, but for his successor, because it's certainly not something that's going to get fixed inside 3 years.
And the financial implications, again, of this shifting in the power equation. What does this mean? Primacy of the dollar, for instance, which we talked a little bit about in our first interview.
Well, it's certainly dangerous to play with the reserve currency status that the dollar enjoys, and to play with its dominance in international transactions. There's nothing just as obvious a replacement for the dollar today as the dollar was for the pound back in the 1950s and 1960s. But I still think we shouldn't be complacent, and that's what worries me when I hear people talking about the benefits of a weaker dollar. Even more important, Consuela, is the role of the US Treasury bond, that the 10-year is the favorite, as the kind of safe asset, the number one safe asset that the world regards as essentially risk-free. Messing with that is also risky, and so the US bond market is really absolutely crucial to the power of the United States. And anything that casts doubt on the stability of US public finances is going to cast doubt on the safe asset status of the US Treasury. So there's a real risk that we run there if we play fast and loose with debt ceilings, if, for example, people who represent the government make it sound as if they might start treating foreign bondholders differently from US bondholders. And then the third thing, what are we going to do to stabilize American public finances? If we don't do that, then it seems to me Ferguson's law just kills us, because inexorably we spend more and more money on interest payments, and that leaves less and less to modernize our missiles, to modernize our Navy, to prepare for the new frontier of warfare in space.
Are you doing anything different with your portfolio, given the uncertainties that we've discussed and this changing, shifting world order?
Well, I think it's always been smart to have an internationally diversified portfolio. That's not something that I've suddenly discovered. What's interesting is that if you go all the way back 20 plus years to the time when Goldman Sachs was singing the praises of the BRICS and telling everybody to get out of developed markets and invest in Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then even South Africa. I mean, that strategy really was a disaster if you took it literally. If you piled all your money into BRICS right at the beginning of the BRICS craze and got out of the US, it was a total disaster. The place to be over the last 20 years was long the United States. And that gave rise, I think, to a slightly naive view that American exceptionalism was just a fact of life, and being long US stocks was the only way to be. History tells us that there are periods when that is certainly not the case. It was not the case in the 1930s, and it was certainly not the case in the 1970s. So diversification is always a good idea. And I think if one looks at the kind of discussions that are being had these days about weaker dollar, tariffs, trade wars, then it makes sense not to be too exposed to the United States. There are lots of exciting opportunities unfolding in parts of the world that we probably neglected. I mean, who knew that Argentina would be one of the superstars of the 2020s since its change of government and the election of the incredible Javier Milei, the most libertarian, ultra-Thatcherite president who's turning that economy around in a way that almost nobody thought was possible. The other thing that I want to emphasize is that we're still at a relatively early stage of rolling out the benefits of the internet and mobile telephony to emerging markets. Financial technology has been a big theme of mine, as you know, Consuelo, for many years. If you look at financial services in the world as a whole, they're still terrible for most people. So I think that's an obvious place where there's still lots of upside. And finally, let's remember, in the short run, the United States has problems. In the long run, it still looks like a much better bet than the People's Republic of China, because the demographics in China are terrible, the debt dynamics are terrible, the growth rate is probably heading down towards zero. On a 10-year view, I'm more positive about the United States than I am about China, because ultimately a free society where entrepreneurs can get access to capital, where immigrants can come and start businesses that they just couldn't have started where they were born, is the superior model. So I think the US is still the best bet over a 10 or even 20-year time horizon. So structurally, I think we, Greenmantle, are long the United States, but we're aware that there's some short-term volatility, some political risk that is not trivial in the next few years.
Short-term volatility, to handle that, are there defensive investments that you are making? I mean, are you holding more cash, for instance, or short-term bonds, or gold, or Bitcoin? I don't know.
Well, Bitcoin has been one of the big winners since we came into existence, since I wrote The Ascent of Money. Back in 2008, the same year the Satoshi paper on Bitcoin was published, and with Bitcoin flirting with $100,000, it was a mistake to be short Bitcoin, that's for sure. And I think there's a sense in which it's almost established itself as digital gold. And I think anybody who doesn't have any in their portfolio has missed out on one of the amazing success stories of our time. And if you want to have a pile of cash, you don't want it all to be dollars, do you? Not with an administration that openly talks of a weaker dollar. But yeah, this is a time to be somewhat defensive, if only because the probability of a US recession has gone up significantly since last year.
I feel as if we're leaving this on a more positive note, in that even your Colossus, the rise and fall of the American Empire doesn't sound like, in your estimation, it's going to fall anytime soon. So.
One of my recurrent arguments, Consuelo, is that things don't rise and fall in that nice, predictable way. History isn't a series of cycles. It's full of surprises and things you didn't predict. And that's why it's important not to get into a mood of declinism and pessimism. I think America can bounce back in ways that will take its adversaries by surprise. But I also know, as famously Adam Smith said, there's a lot of ruin in a nation, and we can certainly do some foolish things or risky things that in the short run can hurt us. But as Scott Bessent said just the other day, the United States is anti-fragile, a great word that my friend Nassim Taleb invented. It actually gains strength from external shocks. We talked about COVID. Think back to 2020. Many people thought this was a disaster for America and great for China, but it turned out quite differently. So don't underestimate the United States. There is a kind of superpower that it has that is the reason it will soon be celebrating 250 years of success as a constitutional republic. And I look forward to celebrating that with you, Consuelo, when it comes.
As do I, with you as a U.S. citizen. Niall Ferguson, thank you so much for joining us on Wealth Track.
My pleasure.
At the close of every Wealth Track, we try to give you one suggestion to help you build and protect your wealth over the long term. This week's action point is think defensively in a portion of your portfolio. Global shocks like the tariff wars and the reordering of geopolitical roles have consequences. They are not always immediate and they are not always predictable. What works in periods of heightened uncertainty? Cash, short-term bonds, and gold. As Niall Ferguson pointed out, the old world order is being challenged in a way it hasn't been in decades. Maybe it's time to find some financial shelter from potential storms. Next week, the state of the government's debt. Grant's interest rate observers Jim Grant weighs in on its impact on the financial markets and the U.S. economy. Please follow us on Facebook, X, and our YouTube channel. Thank you for spending time with us. Have a lovely weekend and make the week ahead a healthy, profitable, and productive one.